We know that we will get weaker as we age. Even if you keep training, we all will hit a point where we start to get weaker and regress. If you have questions, please feel free to email us, podcast@verse.fit. Otherwise, you can comment below or just like our podcast. Welcome back once again to the Verse Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Robert. I'm the head product designer here at Verse, and I've been a personal trainer for about 20 years. We only have a couple questions today, but I think they're important ones, and I really wanted to address them. So, although there's not a lot, it'll hopefully be an informative podcast. Our first question comes from Nate. And Nate says, I recently heard a roundtable discussion, I think I know what he's talking about here, on squats and whether they are necessary. In this roundtable, they said that they're probably more injurious than beneficial. What are your thoughts on this? I'm very familiar with this roundtable and the people on it. I listened to the same discussion. Some of the people involved in it have been on this bandwagon for as long as I've been around, one in particular. I respectfully just have to disagree. There's a lot of caveats to that. I'm not afraid to name names. It's Mike Boyle. He's a strength and conditioning coach. I think he's retired now mostly, but he used to work with athletes all the way up through the professional level. And for his population, is the cost-benefit ratio of squats worth it? These people don't need to squat for their sport. Just being stronger, possibly bigger, depending on the sport, is going to be hugely beneficial. At a certain level of strength and recovery need, squats can be quite demanding on the body and maybe not worth it. If you're going to be squatting 500, 600, 700 pounds as possibly an NFL player or NHL or something, and that's going to take a lot out of your central nervous system. That's going to take away from your ability to recover from the workout or the practice you have to do on the field, ice, the court, wherever your sport is. And you then have a decrease in the output of your sport. It's definitely not worth it. As far as injuries go, I think we need to look at all exercises on a continuum. And I really disagree with this idea that there are bad exercises. There are exercises that might be bad for you, and the cause of that could be a lot of different things. It could be that you never really quite learned how to do it properly. And I think in a lot of instances, that is the issue, is people just don't have very good technique with it. It could be that you have some sort of a biological issue that prevents you from doing this exercise correctly. Some people have really interesting and different hip musculature, or the shape of their hips is kind of odd. And so that can put them in weird positions. If you have interesting limb lengths, for instance, you're very long-legged and short-torsoed, or vice versa, this can change your leverages and make one exercise easier or one exercise harder. A classic example of that might be someone with short legs, long torso, long arms. They're probably going to be a really good sumo deadlifter, but if you try to put them on conventional, they're not going to be very good at it likely, and they might even get a lot of back pain and discomfort from it. Does that mean a conventional deadlift is bad? No, it just means that for these people, the sumo deadlift is a superior way of deadlifting. Conversely, someone with really long legs, short torso, try to put them on a sumo, and it's going to be a terrible movement. They're going to hate it. But if you put them on conventional, they're going to do much better. So it just depends on the population. I think, obviously, if you want to be a powerlifter, you're going to have to squat. There's really no choice there. That's part of the sport. If you are a weightlifter, Olympic weightlifter, I suppose you could not squat. There's always been stories of, at a certain level of strength, X-lifter or X-lifting team stopped back squatting because it was too much stress on their lower backs, or it took too much out of them and prevented them from being able to train in the sport of Olympic weightlifting in the movements that they needed to train. I think most of that's kind of nonsense. If you look at some of the exercises that people will attribute that to, for instance, the Bulgarian split squat. Say, oh, they do the Bulgarian split squat. Well, I mean, maybe some people did, but it certainly wasn't the Bulgarians. Their program was famously snatch, clean and jerk, squat, power versions of the snatch, clean and jerk, and front squat to a max every day, multiple times a day. So they certainly weren't the ones doing the Bulgarian split squat. So who was it, you know? And in fact, I've never even seen an article or a textbook or anything that alludes to that movement coming from Bulgaria. The only thing related to single leg that I've seen come from Bulgaria supposedly was an article in the late 70s or early 80s written by Angel Spazov and Terry Todd, and they were espousing a step up, not a split squat. So, if you're a weightlifter, your sport demands each movement be done in a squat. You're catching a snatch in a squat, you're catching a clean in a front squat position. So you need to be used to standing up from a bilateral squat. You need to be used to loading your body in a squat pattern. Most people already have pretty strong legs. In fact, there's some schools of thought in Olympic weightlifting that you really don't need to squat more than like 10% more than your max clean. I think that's for people that are very efficient at the movements. If you're not efficient, then you're going to want a little bit more strength reserve because it'll make any of those inefficiencies easier and it won't tire you out as much when you're doing the lift. But because your legs are already pretty strong, one of the biggest benefits to squatting for a weightlifter is the stability in the trunk torso area. You need to have that very strong and stable because when you're under load and having to stand up from it in a dynamic way, if this is weak, it doesn't matter how strong your legs are. If either of those are your sport, you probably need to do some kind of squatting. If you're a powerlifter, you definitely need to do some kind of squatting because that's literally your sport. If you're a weightlifter, you could make an argument that you could get away with not squatting. You definitely need stronger legs and stronger back, but you would have to replace front and back squats with something, I don't know, so many exercises. It would be probably a leg curl, some kind of single leg movement, a leg press, maybe a hack squat, possibly leg extensions, good mornings, back extensions, which are probably things you're already doing because you need your back and posterior chain strong. So yeah, I guess you as a weightlifter, you could get away with not doing it, but the time cost would be extremely high. And frankly, I still don't think it would carry over quite as well as a front or back squat. If you're an average population person that just wants to look better, move better, feel better, you can definitely not barbell back squat or barbell front squat. I do think that those patterns, the squat pattern is very important and you should still train it to some degree and you should definitely still have the mobility to do it. We as a species are built to squat. No one 10,000 years ago was sitting on a toilet. So if you needed to use, what we would now call going to the bathroom, if you had to do that, you were dropping into a squat. If you've ever been out backcountry camping, if you lack the requisite mobility to drop into a squat, it can get kind of awkward when you're trying to do your ablutions. The ability to do a squat is something that everyone has, and the mobility aspect of it, everyone should have that, and they can build it over time. If you want to load that, we can then discuss whether that's appropriate for your current level of mobility and your build and all those things. Putting a barbell on your back isn't the only way to do it. Goblet squats, of course, are the classic one invented by Dan John. They're a great teaching tool, and they can progress all the way up as far as you need. You take a 120-pound dumbbell and do 20 reps of goblet squat, you're going to be smoked. Your entire body is going to be tired. There's still benefit to that. Yeah, maybe it won't carry over to doing 400 or 500-pound squats, but it's still going to be very beneficial for overall strength. It's still going to be very beneficial for building muscle. And in daily life, that's probably more than enough. And I've heard that argument about just bodyweight squats. If you can do a bodyweight squat, what more do you need? The only time you'll ever squat in real life is standing up and down off the toilet or a chair or whatever. But we know that we will get weaker as we age. Even if you keep training, we all will hit a point where we start to get weaker and regress. So I'm of the school that I would much rather have an incredibly high level of strength to begin with so that when it diminishes, it's still much higher than just adequate. Because if I can only do a bodyweight squat or even 10 bodyweight squats right now, in 30 years, how many bodyweight squats might I be able to do? 2? Even if it's 10, the amount of effort it takes is still so much higher than if I have a reserve of strength. So keeping that squat pattern in your training in some way, I think is still very important. If you don't want to load your spine, great. You can do a belt squat. Goblet squats technically are loading your spine, but much less so than a back squat. You're going to get a lot less shearing force. And so, I consider that a pretty neutral loading pattern. You could do an overhead squat. You could do a front squat. You could do a lumberjack squat. You could do a bear hug squat with a sandbag. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And of course, there's the unilateral movements, which on this roundtable is what was being advocated for. And I'm not against that. I'm not against unilateral movements. You want to do split squats, you want to do reverse lunges, those kinds of things. Fantastic. Awesome. Do those too. But I think that I have not trained very many people who lack general overall strength and the ability to do, say, a barbell back squat or a fairly heavy goblet squat that can just seamlessly go into single leg work and be good at it and strong at it and get benefit. The progress that you make if you only start with unilateral work, and I have definitely done that because some people just really, even a squat is too advanced, but just starting with unilateral work, you progress so much slower because the strength just, I can't explain it, but the strength doesn't build in the same way. There's so much more instability. There's just so much more discomfort. Whereas if I can build someone up to a certain point of bilateral strength, it carries over much better to unilateral strength. And this idea of the bilateral deficit, which is to say you're actually stronger, like leg for leg, on one leg than you are with two. So for example, if you're a 400-pound squatter for one, there's a good chance you could do 200 pounds for more than one rep on one leg or more than 200 pounds, right? The trunk and core stability that I touched on earlier for weightlifters still applies to this. If you can build up the strength to be able to stabilize a squat properly, when you go to do that single leg stuff, it's going to feel that much easier because you're stable. The more stable the environment, the greater the force output, the greater the hypertrophy effect, all those things. So to discount the benefit that something like a barbell squat, be it front or back, has on the trunk stability is short-sighted in my opinion as well. And if you want to touch on, if you have an injury, then back squats are a problem. Great. If you have an injury, then don't squat if it is exacerbated by squatting. No one's saying that you have to do this exercise with heavy weight on your back. All we're saying is, or at least all I'm saying is, you should maintain this movement pattern. From a bang for your buck perspective, it's hard to beat a barbell back squat. It really is. You work so many muscles. It builds mobility. It gives you a huge cardio benefit. Like if you've ever done high rep squats, you'll see that your heart is just beating through the roof. And yeah, that can happen with unilateral, but that's mostly because you're doing double the amount of work. It's one side than the other side. So I just think it's short-sighted to say any exercise is bad and no one should do it. Because I think every exercise has a purpose in the right population. And to say, because some populations get little tweaks from it or it causes injury or they don't like it or whatever the case, that means no population should do it. I think that's crazy. We don't really do that with anything else in life. Some people have dyslexia and they can't really learn to read the way normal people learn to read. So we don't go, then no one should learn how to read in this way. We should all teach everyone this other way. Well, no, we don't do that. We say, okay, well, you will learn this special way because that's what you need. It's the same thing with an exercise. It's not a wrong exercise or a bad exercise. It's just wrong exercise for you or bad exercise for you. But also don't confuse a wrong or bad exercise for what is actually wrong or bad form. Learn how to do it. Get at least a little strong on it, then assess whether or not it's right for you. I think if you look at most of these athletes that they're referring to about, they don't need to back squat or front squat or any of that, these are not people that are using 135. They're probably not even using 315, these people. A lot of them are going to be a lot stronger than that. And then you can make an argument, do they really need this? Once you hit a 2 times bodyweight squat, your benefit to sports performance really starts to diminish. Your running speed doesn't really benefit that much more. Your rate of force development, all those kinds of things, they don't really increase by that much. So fine, from an athletic perspective, you don't need to do it. But how many people are out here squatting 2 times body weight? Once you get to that point, maybe we can have this discussion. Until then, I'm just really hesitant to throw the baby out with the bathwater on that one. And again, that's any exercise. I'm not going to sit here and vilify behind the neck presses or upright rows or pullovers, Jefferson curls, whatever. I think that there is a time and a place for every exercise depending on the person and their needs. So to have these kinds of discussions are a little bit silly because it really should just come down to, is this right for you in this situation? If it's not, don't do it. But it is for a lot of people. Great. That should be the end of discussion, in my opinion. That's a good question, though, because it's something I've thought about a lot. It's been around for years. I can remember when I first came into the industry, Mike Boyle was around then. He's been around forever. He's a legend. I respect him. And he had acolytes who did some pretty cool single leg stuff. I remember there was a guy, Ben Bruno, and he had all kinds of videos in the early days of social media, YouTube, doing split squats, Bulgarian split squats with a weight vest and some chains, holding a big old dumbbell in the goblet position or whatever. That's really cool. Awesome. But I also love to see a really heavy back squat. So I just like to see people lift heavy stuff. Good question though, Nate. Okay, this next question is from Liz. And Liz says, I have recently gotten into barbell training after exclusively doing kettlebells for 5 years. That's a pretty good intro, depending on what you were doing. But I like kettlebells. As I've been trying to learn more, I came across Prilepin's chart. And frankly, I am confused. Yeah. What is this chart and how is it helpful / how do I use it? I vividly remember having the same issue when I was younger in my training days. When I first started to get really interested in training, Prilepin's chart popped up a lot. At the time, probably the most vocal people online were powerlifters. At least when it came to strength training, there was tons of bodybuilding nonsense out there. But when it came to like powerlifting and truly building strength, and most of those were kind of West Side people, whether they trained at West Side or not, they were doing West Side inspired type of training, which is to say like max effort, dynamic effort, accommodating resistance, this kinds of stuff, which I covered in a previous podcast. Louis and some of the West Side guys, I said, oh, look at Prilepin's chart. Prilepin's chart tells you, how to train and what to do. And so you pull up this chart and then it's really not that useful on the surface. And for anyone who's not familiar, Prilepin's chart is this chart that you see that gives you different intensity zones, intensity being percentage of 1 rep max, so like 60 to 70, 70 to 80, 80 to 90, 90 to 100. And then it says how many reps you should do per set, a range of volume that you should do for a total amount of volume, so the minimum amount of reps, the optimal amount of reps, and the maximum amount of reps for each intensity zone. And then, of course, those total rep ranges would be done using the reps per set that's listed. So, for example, in the 70 to 80 range, you do 3 to 6 reps per set. In the 80 to 90, you do 2 to 4. For example, in 80 to 90, you do between 10 reps as the minimum to 20 reps as the maximum, with 15 being the ideal. So this is how you set it up. And you sort of see that, you go, okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense, I get it. But it stops there, and there's a lot of limitations. For example, what if I'm doing work in multiple intensity zones? How does that affect the total volume? How often am I supposed to do this? So there's a lot of questions that don't really get addressed when you just get introduced to this chart. And I think to really understand what this chart is and maybe how to use it, we need to take a step back and discuss Prilepin and Russian training in general. So it's gonna be a little bit long-winded, but I promise you we'll get to exactly how to use this chart to your biggest benefit, in my opinion. So A.S. Prilepin, who made this chart, was a Russian sports scientist, and he worked with the Russian junior national weightlifting team for about 5 years, I think between 1975 and 1980, or 74 and 79, something like that. And he was very successful. And then he became the senior weightlifting coach for another 5 years and was very successful. Many of the people he worked with are names that we would recognize today. This was a very strong period in, at the time, Soviet Olympic weightlifting. And the Soviets/Russians, they took lifting very seriously. It was truly a science to them. They studied weightlifting. They created hypotheses on the correct way to train. They tested them. They made meticulous notes, and then they made changes and repeated the process. Truly a scientific method of creating training. What is the ideal? It's from this that we have many modern concepts. Periodization, for example. The first real model of periodization that we recognize, which is the Medvedev model, starting with a high volume, linearly progressing to lower volume, heavier weights. That came out of Soviet sports science. Block periodization, conjugate or concurrent periodization, everything you can think of basically stems from a lot of these sports science. And of course, like everything, there's multiple people around the world doing the same thing at the same time. But because this was so academic in the Soviet Union, it was then put down as research studies or in books that you could read, whereas a lot of the other stuff was being done much more anecdotally. So principles were developed that started to be applied to all of the training that happened in Soviet weightlifters. Sports performance was maybe a little bit different, things like track and field, although there was a lot of crossover. But to say that there was one school of Soviet weightlifting isn't exactly right. I'm sure if you were with this coach, it'd be a little bit different. If you were with that coach, they would do things in their own way. If you were in this region, that region, much like it is in China today, people have this view of, Chinese weightlifting as it's monolithic program that comes from, I don't know, the CCP or something. But it's really different in different regions and with different coaches, but they all just follow sort of a similar methodology. And that's exactly how it was in the Soviet Union. To understand what that methodology was helps inform Prilepin's chart. So the basic idea of their methodology was you set a certain amount of lifts per month. And these would be made up of the various exercises that you would do. Depending on the coach, would depend on what those exercises were that were counted. So for example, a weightlifter is definitely going to count all snatch and snatch related exercises. So this would be like snatch, classic snatch, power snatch, hang variations, block variations, pause variations, any sort of variation of snatch, that's definitely going to count. Same thing with any variation of clean and jerk, or you could break it up clean and any variation of jerk, depending on the coach and how you set it up. Squats are definitely going to be in there. Pulls are definitely going to be in there. Then it is up to the individual coach on what other exercises they want to track for volume. If you're doing some small exercise like lateral raise or pull-ups or something, would you track that? Probably not, though some coaches maybe got that detailed. But in the overall picture, those aren't really that stressful of exercises, so it's really just these stressful exercises. So you're starting with this monthly volume, and then you're going to determine how you distribute that volume. The Soviets like to use a wave pattern, a sinusoidal wave, and it could be distributed in any number of ways, but generally there would be a 20% delta between each week. So a popular ratio would be like a medium to medium high volume week on week 1, say 28% of the monthly volume. Then medium to medium low on the following week, maybe something like 22% of the monthly volume. Then the highest volume week, which would be maybe like 35, and then a lower volume week, which would be say 50, some variation of that. And then you could mix up where the high and the low and all these things are. But it was very rarely just a static amount of volume over the week, like 5x5, adding weight each week, not really something that was part of this system in most cases. This was uncoupled from the intensity. That 15% week 4 wasn't, and we're only going to do low intensity below 70% or something. Those were uncoupled. You could still wave the intensity, but it was unrelated to the volume. But you would determine within each intensity zone how much monthly volume you are going to do. So, for example, let's say you are going to do 1,000 lifts this month, which sounds crazy, but it's really not that high if it's spread across all the lifts that you're going to track. And just for the simplicity's sake, 1,000's easy math. Okay, so 1,000 lifts this month. And you say, I want 25% of my snatch lifts to be in the 80 to 85% zone. Okay, great. That means you're going to do 250 lifts in that 80 to 85% zone. This isn't necessarily realistic, so just keep that in mind. And so, okay, but I want to do 12% of my lifts in 90% plus. All right, so you know you're going to do, in the month, 12 lifts somewhere between 90 and 100%, right? So that's simple how you break it down. And because this is Olympic weightlifting, it's highly technical, and rate of force development and explosiveness is very important. Fatigue is really bad for both of those things. As you fatigue, your technique breaks down and your rate of force development goes down. So the Soviets developed a model of working between 1/3 and 2/3 of max reps per set. So what does that mean? That means if you can do this weight for 10 reps, you should use it for between 3 and 6 reps. Think about that. Between 3 and 6. What does that sound like? Maybe a little bit like Prilepin's chart in that 70 to 80% zone range, right? So keep this in mind as a general framework for training. You have your total monthly amount of lifts. You have the percentage of each total lift in the different ranges that you want to work. And you have this between 1/3 and 2/3. Now, Prilepin comes along and he's trying to figure out how to create guidelines to follow for training. So he has this framework in mind, and he takes the training journals of 5,000, I think, highly qualified lifters. These are people that are lifting at the national and international level. And he analyzes their training over these many year periods, their training journals, which were kept very meticulous. And he looked at what was being done. And he said, okay, in this range, typically they're doing this many reps. And they're doing this many reps per set. In this range, they're doing this many total lifts or this many minimum lifts to be a stimulating workout. So this is to say it will cause an adaptation in strength, neuromuscular efficiency, perhaps muscle, or if they do this many reps, it's too much and the recovery starts to be challenging and it affects their next workout. Because there was also this idea of sort of, to quote Rudolf Pluckfelder, one of the eminent coaches of the Soviet Union, better, less, but more. So rather than the bodybuilding model of smash your face into the ground, go to failure and beyond, and then take a week to recover, they say do a little bit to stimulate the body to get better, take a rest, come back, do some more. That could be later today, that could be tomorrow, that could be whenever, but the idea is this allows you to accumulate even more work and practice than just smashing your face into the ground once a week. You've now got these boundaries of how many reps per set you should do, and then a range of what is a stimulating amount of total reps and what is probably too hard to recover from amount of reps. And then that middle zone of like what seems to be perfect. He takes all this information, compiles this chart, uses it as a framework, becomes highly successful as the junior national coach, as I mentioned, then becomes highly successful as the senior national coach. Using this chart, he bumps up the average intensity by having them do more 90% plus lifts than previous coaches had been doing. And for Olympic weightlifting, that is very beneficial because you need to be closer to your max for the technical similarities, right? You can do 75%, 80%, and it'll carry over, but not quite as well because these lifts are so technical that even just a couple pounds different starts to change things a lot. So he has this chart. He's using it very successfully. It becomes infamous, and people go, oh, great. Here's this thing. Let's use it and go. But what they neglected to take into account is that this was created looking at snatch and clean and jerk. Only snatch and clean and jerk. It was not looking at squats. It was not looking at deadlifts, bench press, any other exercise that you can think. So can you build a training program around it? I mean, you can. Sure. Lots of people have. In fact, I've seen tons that use Prilepin's chart as a guideline. Does it work? Sure, it can, because anything can work. Does that mean it's as effective as it could be? No, not necessarily. If you go in and you're squatting 70% and you're doing sets of 3, okay, I guess as long as you're getting enough work, it'll be beneficial. And that set of 3 is going to allow you to really put some explosivity into it. But depending on your goal, those sets may not be as stimulating as you want. So I think what lessons we should take is the concept of a chart is really great, especially if you're doing it from the perspective of working between 1/3 and 2/3 of max reps within a percentage of your 1 rep max. And then also looking at, okay, what's an amount of reps that I don't really benefit from? because it's too little stimulation. What's an amount of reps that's too high? It wears into my recovery too much. I'm sore for days. It interferes with my sleep. My central nervous system is weird. I try to type at work and I make mistakes, whatever the case may be. We all have that threshold. And establishing for yourself what that is for each movement. So for instance, squat, probably 3 to 6 reps at 70% for most people. That's pretty easy. If you're very explosive, which most of these weightlifters would have been, maybe that makes sense because you're super type 2. You're not very good at endurance type movements, which 10 plus reps on a squat is kind of an endurance type event if you're very explosive or you're a weightlifter. So it might make sense, but for most of us, it doesn't. But taking that concept and saying, okay, I'm going to take 70% of my max and go for a max rep set, whatever you get, 22 reps, I don't know. Whatever it is. You say, okay, I'm going to go between 1/3 and 2/3 of that as my rep range that I'm going to work in. And that's going to allow you to have really crisp technique. If you go back to our earlier question about squats and whether they're useful or bad, technique breakdown is definitely bad. So by keeping it in a lower rep range, farther away from potential technical failure, you're going to be much safer, but you're also going to be moving that weight very explosively. Is that going to build as much muscle as approaching failure? The science currently would say no, but it will build just as much strength. And because you're less fatigued, you'll be able to do more reps throughout the week. And that potentially will lead to more muscle, even though you're not approaching failure. If you're worried about muscle and you're not approaching failure, that's what assistance work is for. Go on the leg extension and extend until you puke. Great. Fine. But doing that on something like squats or deadlifts or bench press really might be kind of detrimental because the recovery demand of that is going to be so high that it's going to limit the total amount of volume that you can do in a week. And when we were talking about the Russian framework of starting with total monthly volume, it's important to remember that their view, and I think they're right about this, is the total amount of loading, that is to say volume, is the main driver of adaptation, not intensity. Intensity is important. That's percentage of 1 rep max. That's important, but that doesn't build lasting strength gains. Anyone who's done a Bulgarian style program for squats on like a Squat-tober or one of those kinds of things where you max out every day, you make a ton of progress. Pile weight on the bar, you add 25, 50, 60 pounds, whatever. But once you stop doing that, you regress back to the mean very quickly. Because it is the total loading over time slowly being raised that drives your long-term adaptation. These are deep-rooted, long-lasting adaptations that you can then take a short period of loading to express into a 1 rep max or whatever the case may be on that exercise. So what I would say to you, Liz, after all of that, is look at Prilepin's chart as an inspiration to create your own chart. For the exercises that are big and technical, like squats, deadlifts, overhead presses, cleans and snatches and those things, it's useful to look at the concept and create your own chart and try to stick to some of those parameters between 1/3 and 2/3 of max reps. And you can wave that over time. Maybe you're starting with 5 reps because that's 1/3. Well, you can build over time to now you're doing those 2/3. Or you can stick with 5 and waive the weight or whatever the case may be. It's also useful to know on days where you're just not really feeling it. I can come in and say, okay, I don't really want to do this. I feel kind of blah, so I'm not going to go heavy. But I know if I take 70% and I do, let's just stick with the original Prilepins, and I do some sets of 3, if I can do 5 sets of 3, that'll give me 15 reps. That's right in that minimum threshold to be stimulating and get a benefit. That's also a great thing to know because we all have those days. Conversely, on the days when you're feeling great and you're like, oh man, I'm going to crush it. Everyone's going to be destroyed by how awesome I am. It's really easy to get carried away. I've definitely had those days. I'll come in, I feel great. I'm going to destroy the world. I'm going to put on some sick music and just go to town. And then I will be wrecked for days. I can know, you know what? I feel awesome. Okay, maybe I'll go to 85%. And for me, that means I can do sets of 4 at my max threshold before it starts to wear me out. Maybe I can do 30 total reps. Cool. Let's do 7 sets of 4. And I'm going to get 28 reps. I'm under that threshold. But man, that's stimulating. Feel good. Those are fast reps. Those are technical reps. I walk out of there feeling even better than when I came in. And guess what? Next time, be it tomorrow or the next day or the day after, I'm ready to go again. As opposed to if I just went YOLO and was like, I'm going to do 100 reps of these squats, or I'm going to max out, and then I'm going to do some back off sets and max out again and be stupid, which I tend historically to do. I will no longer do that because I have this framework and these guidelines. So that's what I would recommend, that anyone who wants to get a benefit from Prilepin's chart, they view it as that. Create a framework for yourself of what is the ideal amount of reps in each intensity zone for you to follow. What is the ideal amount of total work, minimum, maximum, and optimal. Boom. That's how you use Prilepin's chart. Okay, so those were the 2 questions we had today. I know they were really detailed. I hope it wasn't too rambling and you were all able to follow it. I think they were really good discussions to have because I've heard these kinds of questions a lot, and there's benefit to everything you do. You just have to make it for you, whether it's an exercise or a table programming guideline. So thank you, Nate, and thank you, Liz, for the questions. If you have questions, you can email us, podcast@verse.fit. You can hit us up on Instagram. We're at Verse Fitness. You can check out our YouTube, which you're probably already on right now. You can check out our store, verse.fit. We have agile racks in stock, and we'll be having more products coming short. Can't go into details, but I think some of them are pretty cool, and I'm very excited for it. Thank you for listening to the Verse Fitness Podcast. I've been your host, Shane Robert. If you want to find out more about Verse, you can check us out at verse.fit. Or if you have any questions, you can email them to podcast@verse.fit. We love to do Q&A episodes. If you have any general comments, feel free to leave them in the area below, or like, view, and subscribe.